I want to read you something that happened to an ordinary American family in 1979. Robert and Linda Mitchell had saved faithfully for 22 years. They owned Treasury bonds, government bonds, the safest investment in America. Every financial advisor they ever spoke to told them the same thing. Treasury bonds are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Nothing is safer. Nothing is more reliable. Nothing will protect your family's savings better than lending money to the most powerful government on earth. By 1980, those bonds had lost 40% of their real purchasing power, not because the government defaulted, not because a single promised payment was missed. Every dollar was paid exactly on schedule. But the inflation that the government created to finance its obligations destroyed the purchasing power of every dollar Robert and Linda received. They were paid in full, in worthless dollars. Now, I want to tell you something that happened last Friday that most Americans do not fully understand yet. Moody's cut America's credit rating. For the first time in history, America has no perfect credit rating left at any major agency. Not one. The last AAA is gone. And the financial media spent the weekend debating whether this was a big deal or a small deal, whether markets would recover, whether the downgrade meant anything real. I posted about it immediately. And what I wrote is the most important thing I have said publicly in months. I wrote this: credit ratings understate credit risks because they only rate the risk of the government not paying its debt. They do not include the greater risk that countries in debt will print money to pay their debts, thus causing holders of the bonds to suffer losses from the decreased value of the money they are getting, rather than from the decreased quantity of money they are getting. Robert and Linda Mitchell were not defaulted on. They were debased, quietly, invisibly, legally, and that is exactly the risk that Moody's rating does not measure. And it is exactly the risk that is larger right now than at any point since 1979. Stay with me through every single minute of this video, because at the halfway point I am going to show you the specific number that tells you precisely how much of this debasement risk is already locked in by decisions that have already been made. A number so specific and so personally alarming that it will permanently change how you think about every dollar sitting in your savings account right now. Do not skip a single second. Robert and Linda did not understand what was happening to their bonds until it was too late. I do not want that to be your story. Subscribe right now. What I am about to share took 50 years of studying how governments actually manage debts they cannot pay to fully understand. Let me start by explaining the distinction that Moody's missed. The distinction between default risk and debasement risk. Because this distinction is the most important financial concept I can give you right now, and most people have never heard it explained clearly. Default risk is what credit rating agencies measure. It is the probability that the government fails to make a promised payment, that a bondholder receives fewer dollars than they were promised. Moody's has spent 150 years developing sophisticated models for measuring this risk, and they are right that America's default risk has increased. That is what their downgrade reflects. But debasement risk is something completely different. It is the probability that the government makes every promised payment exactly on schedule while simultaneously creating enough new money to ensure that the dollars being paid are worth dramatically less than the dollars that were originally borrowed. Robert and Linda Mitchell experienced zero default risk and catastrophic debasement risk simultaneously. They received every promised payment and lost 40% of their real wealth. Right now, America's debasement risk is higher than its default risk by an order of magnitude, and Moody's rating does not measure debasement risk at all. Their downgrade is like a doctor who examines a patient with severe heart disease and reports only on the patient's broken finger. Technically accurate, catastrophically incomplete. Let me show you exactly why the debasement risk is so severe right now. And I want to give you the specific numbers because the numbers make this completely undeniable. The United States government currently spends $7 trillion per year. It collects $5 trillion in taxes. That $2 trillion annual gap must be financed somehow. The primary mechanism for financing it has been borrowing through Treasury bond sales. But here is the number that should stop you cold. The United States must refinance nearly $10 trillion of existing debt in the next 24 months alone. $10 trillion. Debt that was originally issued at near zero interest rates in 2020 and 2021 must now be refinanced at dramatically higher rates. The additional interest cost of that refinancing adds hundreds of billions of dollars to an annual interest bill that already exceeds $1 trillion. And here is the mechanism that connects those numbers directly to your savings account. As the interest bill grows faster than tax revenues can cover it, as foreign buyers reduce their treasury purchases, as the gap between what the government needs and what voluntary borrowing provides widens. The Federal Reserve faces pressure to step in, to create new dollars to purchase treasury bonds that the market will not absorb at sustainable rates. And every new dollar the Federal Reserve creates dilutes the value of every existing dollar. Every new dollar is a quiet, invisible transfer of purchasing power from the people who hold dollars to the government that created them. This is not theoretical. It happened to Robert and Linda Mitchell in the 1970s. It is happening right now. The dollar has already lost 25% of its purchasing power since 2020 alone, in 5 years. 25%, while the numbers in most savings accounts showed either stability or modest growth. The numbers stayed the same. The purchasing power quietly disappeared. Now I need to stop here and tell you something personal, because understanding where this warning comes from gives it the weight it deserves. In 1982, I sat in an empty office with nothing. I had publicly predicted a depression. I was completely certain I was right. I borrowed $4,000 from my father to pay my family's bills while my wife and 2 young sons depended on me. That failure taught me the single most important lesson of my 50-year career. Not what I got wrong about markets, what I got wrong about how governments actually behave when their debts become unsustainable. I got wrong the assumption that governments would choose the difficult, honest path, the path of genuine spending cuts, genuine tax increases, genuine fiscal discipline. I assumed that when faced with unsustainable debt, democratic governments would make hard choices. They do not make hard choices. They print money. They debase the currency. They pay their debts in dollars worth less than the dollars they borrowed. They do it quietly. They do it gradually. They do it in ways that most ordinary people never fully understand until the purchasing power is already gone. And they do it every single time, in every country, in every historical period, without a single exception across 50 years of my research and 500 years of recorded economic history. Moody's downgrade is the moment when the bond market's most conservative voice has officially acknowledged that America's fiscal trajectory is unsustainable. But what Moody's did not say, what their rating system is not designed to say, is that the resolution of that unsustainable trajectory will most likely come through the mechanism that destroyed Robert and Linda Mitchell's savings, not default. Debasement. And here is the part that I promised you at the halfway point, the specific number that tells you how much debasement risk is already locked in. At the current rate, the United States will be $50 trillion in debt by 2035. I posted this number publicly on X the same day as the Moody's downgrade, not as a prediction, as a mathematical calculation of the current trajectory. $50 trillion in 10 years. To put that in personal terms, your family's current share of the national debt is approximately $230,000. In 10 years at the current trajectory, your family's share will be approximately $425,000, nearly double. And every dollar of that additional $195,000 per family must be financed through some combination of borrowing and money creation. In an environment where foreign buyers are already reducing their treasury purchases, where the political system is paralyzed, where tax increases and spending cuts of the scale required are politically impossible before November 2026. The money creation component of that financing is not a risk to be considered. It is a mathematical certainty to be prepared for. This is the risk that is greater than the rating agencies are conveying. This is what I wrote immediately after Moody's announcement. And this is what every person who holds dollar-denominated savings needs to understand before the debasement that finances the 50 trillion trajectory erodes the real value of those savings, the way it eroded Robert and Linda Mitchell's bond portfolio between 1971 and 1980. Now let me show you something that most financial commentators completely missed in their coverage of the Moody's downgrade. Something that connects everything I have shown you to the specific actions you need to take right now. On the same day that Moody's cut America's rating, gold hit a new record high. On the same day that Moody's confirmed that America's fiscal trajectory is unsustainable, the asset that specifically measures debasement risk hit an all-time high. That is not a coincidence. That is the market's precise reaction to the distinction I described at the beginning of this video. The market looked at the Moody's downgrade and concluded the same thing I concluded. The real risk is not default. The real risk is debasement. And the asset that specifically protects against debasement risk hit an all-time record the same day the downgrade was confirmed. Gold has now risen more than 70% in the past 12 months. Central banks purchased more gold in 2024 and 2025 than at any point since 1967. Every sophisticated institutional investor on Earth is positioning for the debasement risk that Moody's does not measure. They are not buying gold because they think the U.S. government will fail to make its bond payments. They are buying gold because they understand that those payments will be made in dollars that are worth less than the dollars that were originally borrowed. They are buying the asset that Robert and Linda Mitchell should have owned in 1971. The asset that would have protected their real purchasing power through the decade that destroyed their bond portfolio. Now let me tell you exactly what to do, not what to think about doing, what to actually do. Starting this week, because the Moody's downgrade is the kind of visible confirmation event that historically marks the transition between the period when acting feels optional and the period when acting feels necessary. And the investors who act at the confirmation event rather than after it are always better positioned than the ones who wait for the next confirmation. Action 1. Understand that your treasury bonds and bond funds are exposed to debasement risk that Moody's does not measure. Not default risk. Debasement risk. The risk that Robert and Linda Mitchell experienced. The risk that destroyed 40% of their real purchasing power while every promised payment arrived on schedule. If you hold long-duration treasury bonds or bond funds in your retirement account or investment portfolio, you are holding assets whose real return depends on how many new dollars the government creates between now and maturity. And the 50 trillion trajectory tells you everything you need to know about how many new dollars are coming. Action 2. Build gold exposure to between 10 and 15% of your total portfolio immediately. This is not a new recommendation from me, but the urgency behind it increased the moment Moody's made their announcement. Because the downgrade that confirmed the unsustainable fiscal trajectory simultaneously confirmed that the debasement mechanism I have been describing is now operating with an official acknowledgement of its underlying cause. Gold rose to a record high on the day of the downgrade for a precise reason. The market understood what Moody's measured and what it did not measure. And the asset that specifically measures what Moody's does not went to an all-time high in response. GLD and IAU provide direct gold exposure through any standard brokerage account at minimal cost. Action 3. Reduce long-duration Treasury bond exposure specifically in favor of shorter duration instruments and TIPS. Treasury inflation-protected securities adjust their principal with inflation. They provide direct protection against the specific debasement mechanism that destroyed Robert and Linda's bond portfolio. A long-duration Treasury bond that locks in 4 or 5% annual payments while inflation runs at 6% produces a guaranteed negative real return for every year inflation exceeds the coupon rate. TIPS eliminate this risk by adjusting their principal with the inflation rate automatically. The iShares TIPS Bond ETF with ticker TIP provides direct access through any standard brokerage account. Action 4. Diversify meaningfully into international assets. The Moody's downgrade is a signal that sophisticated global investors have already been acting on for months. European stocks outperformed American stocks by 23% last year. Chinese stocks outperformed by 21%. These were not stories about European and Chinese economic strength. They were stories about global capital rotating away from assets denominated in a currency whose debasement risk is rising. That rotation is not complete. The investors who are already positioned in international assets will capture the returns of the next phase of that rotation. The investors who wait until the rotation is complete will have missed it entirely. VXUS provides broad international equity exposure through any standard brokerage account. Action 5. Act today. Not because the crisis is tomorrow, because the Moody's downgrade is the confirmation event that historically marks the beginning of the acceleration phase in government debt debasement cycles. Robert and Linda Mitchell could have protected themselves in 1971 when Nixon ended the gold standard and the debasement mechanism was activated. They could have protected themselves in 1973 when the first oil shock revealed how severe the inflation would become. They could have protected themselves in 1977 when the pattern was undeniably clear. They waited, because each moment of warning still felt like it might not be as bad as it seemed. And by 1980, the opportunity to protect their savings at reasonable cost had already passed. The Moody's downgrade is your 1971 moment, not the end of the process, the beginning of the acute phase. The moment when the confirmation arrived and the window to act at reasonable cost was still open. But, as 1971 showed us, that window does not stay open forever. And the people who act at the confirmation, rather than after the confirmation, are the ones whose savings survive the debasement that follows. Moody's just confirmed what I have been warning about. But what they confirmed is the smaller of the two risks, the default risk. The real danger, the debasement risk, the risk that destroyed Robert and Linda Mitchell's savings while every promised payment arrived on schedule, is far worse than anything Moody's rating system is designed to capture. The 50 trillion trajectory is locked in. The debasement mechanism is already operating. Gold is at all-time highs because the smartest money on earth already understands what Moody's does not measure. And the window to position yourself correctly before the debasement that finances the 50 trillion trajectory erodes the real value of your savings is still open right now. Robert and Linda Mitchell trusted their bonds. They trusted the full faith and credit of the United States government. They received every promised payment, and they lost 40% of their real wealth. You have information they did not have. You have the Moody's confirmation. You have the gold signal. You have the 50 trillion number. And you have the specific actions that can protect you from the risk that Moody's does not measure. Use them. Now, while the window is still open, if this video explained the Moody's downgrade in a way that no other channel did, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we are tracking every development of this debt crisis together in real time as it unfolds. And leave one honest comment below answering this question. Before this video, did you know that Moody's credit rating does not measure the risk of inflation destroying your bond returns? Write yes or no below and tell me what you are going to do differently this week. I read every single comment personally, and I will see you in the next video.